So good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I thank you in advance for indulging me in English. So you would not want to hear me trying to speak Portuguese, I'm sure. The small compensation that I will make is I will try not to speak American English, but rather international English. I speak, when I speak to native English speakers, Brits or Americans, I really do tell them that they also need to be learning another language. They think that they can be speaking American or British, but they really can't. They have to be speaking international English if they're operating in an international context. So it's a small compensation for being able to use one's native language, really, as the lingua franca. Nevertheless, it's something. I was pleased to hear about CITAR Brazil and happy to be supporting CITAR Brazil. I've been involved in CITAR formation since more or less the beginning. It started as an international organization, and then there was a kind of revolt, and it broke up, and then has then emerged as a kind of 1,000 flowers blooming. So far going better than the original one of those. And Brazil is one of those flowers that's blooming around the world in creating these networks that are largely professional support networks for people who do intercultural work. The perspective that I take, as you heard from this Constructivist Foundations, is a particular perspective that's related more to the communication roots of intercultural. So intercultural now, the term intercultural frequently is used without communication, meaning those people who do all kinds of work dealing with relations between cultures. But originally, intercultural was associated with communication in its origins with Edward T. Hall, an anthropologist who was a crossover between anthropology and communication. And so the term intercultural communication was in fact the original term. I will continue to take that perspective, not because I think it's superior to other perspectives, but that I think there continues to be value in the root of intercultural in communication. Looking at it as a communication, as an application of communication, rather than as a general topic of culture. So I'll be taking that perspective, but let me be clear that it is a perspective and that there are other ways of thinking about what interculturalists do. My topic today is, as you can see here, perceptual agility, intercultural communication, as I was just saying, and good jokes. I'll make some apologies about the good jokes. I mean in general humor, or at least the intention of humor. But perceptual agility, it refers to new cognitive science research about what it is that the brain seems to be doing when it is involved in bilingual and, by extension, bicultural activity. And in reading that research, which I do, it struck me that what they're talking about is a whole lot like what has been generally talked about in the area in studying humor. So I, at one point, had studied how humor works, and I was kind of interested in, not because I'm so humorous really, but I was kind of interested in the theory of humor. And in fact, it's rather similar to the theory of the current theories of bilingualism and biculturalism. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I have a new book, which is the revision of this book. So this is the book from whatever it is, too long ago, 1998, right? And I finally got around to doing a revision of that book.
something? Guidance?
There we go.
You said you had to do a monitor.
Yes, you have to change the monitors.
Yeah, let me,
It was there.
I know.
Desktop.
Yeah, well, there it goes again. Yeah, I'll use this mode, it was just a different, I was using the presenter mode that wasn't doing so well. So, here is the book. So for those of you who are looking for an update on this communication or constructivist-based approach to intercultural communication, I would recommend this book. It's available in electronic form, so you can get it off of Amazon. You can just download it off of Amazon. It's from Intercultural Press. I mean, this book continues to be interesting. What the new one does is to trim down some of the articles. So some of the articles that I have, the so-called classic articles, turned out to not be so classic. Some of them I have continued to think are central to the field, and so I've maintained them. And then I've expanded the first part of the book to about half the book. So it's become a kind of mini textbook. So that may act as a reference for those of you who'd like to follow up on that. So let me start out with the best jokes in the world. And I have a few caveats. Do you use the term caveat?
No.
A few warnings about this. So one of them is, so that's my caveat. Here's the first joke. And these jokes were, in fact, voted on this particular website, which was a kind of international website. Who knows how many Brazilians might have been on these. But these jokes were voted to be the best jokes. The first one is about Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Are you familiar with the characters of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson? All right. Holmes and Watson went on a camping trip. When they got to their site, they pitched their tent, they had a wonderful dinner, a bottle of wine, had that kind of nice conversation you have, and then they retired for the night. After several hours, Sherlock Holmes awakened and shook his friend and said, "Watson, look up at the sky and tell me what you see." And Watson looked up at the sky and he said, "I see the stars. I see millions and millions of stars." And Holmes said, "But Watson, what does it mean?" And Watson thought, well, it means that we are small, insignificant beings in the large galactic expanses, and it makes you just think about the meaning of life. And he said, "No, you idiot, someone stole the tent." The second joke that was voted best joke in the world, okay? Two hunters are out in the woods, and one of them collapses. So he doesn't seem to be breathing, and his eyes are glazed. So the other guy takes out his cell phone, and he calls up the emergency number in the United States. It's 911. So he calls it 911, and he says to the operator at 911, he says, "My friend, I'm afraid that my friend is dead, what should I do? And the operator on the other end says, well, first of all, let's make sure that he's dead. So please go check and see. So the operator hears a gunshot, and then comes back and he says, okay, now what? So these are two of the best jokes in the world, according to the website. Now, what I'd like to do is to analyze these jokes, possibly with more interest than the actual telling of them, in terms of Arthur Koestler. Arthur Koestler is a person who has written a book, a very classic book called The Act of Creation. And in The Act of Creation, he has brought together a study of humor with a study of creativity. And the basic principle that he explores in this study is that all humor depends on what he calls bisociation. Bisociation. And here's the definition of that. The perceiving of a situation in two self-consistent but habitually incompatible frames of reference. By self-sufficient, it means that each one of these frames could exist on its own, but generally they're not looked at together. You don't see them occurring together. So the creativity or the humor occurs when you look at things in two ways together, in two ways that generally aren't put together. So here's what it looks like. The bisociation we can think of as being an intersection of planes. And on one plane, you can't, it's not working very well, but this one says, campfire philosophizing. If you could snap off just this light here, you'd be helpful. Not that one. No, not that one. Leave that one on.
The last one.
That one. Yeah, okay. Maybe, yeah, you could just leave this one on if you would, because it, yeah, it gives us a little more light.
All right.
It says campfire philosophizing. So one of the frames of reference that's in the Sherlock Holmes joke, one of the frames of reference is the campfire philosophizing around the campfire, and the other one is analysis of crime. So he's saying, who stole the tent? So the bisociation here is, on the one hand, here we are going camping, talking about philosophy and being under the stars, and the other one is stealing the tent and trying to figure out who did it. So it's the bisociation of these two things that makes it kind of funny. Okay. On the other one, the other joke, the bisociation, on the one hand is seeking help. So here's this person who's going, oh no, I'm so worried about my friend. And on the other hand, murdering his friend. And once again, these two frames of reference generally are not considered together. So it's the perceiving of the situation, the dead hunter, or, well, the maybe dead hunter, or the stolen tent. Perceiving that situation in two different ways and then putting them together. Okay. So, this same kind of thing works in visual humor. I have a warning up here called, these jokes are religious and political jokes. Now, I don't know if I really need to give that one. Do I need to give you that warning? If I were doing this in Europe, in Italy, or in Germany, I wouldn't have to give that warning.
No.
But I actually was doing this presentation initially in a U.S. context. And as you probably know, U.S. Americans are reluctant to speak about religion and politics publicly. And in fact, they sometimes are rather critical of people who do that. On the other hand, Northern Europeans feel if you don't talk about religion and politics, you're probably kind of stupid. And it creates then a rather interesting situation when you have a mixed group. You know, because I run into this a lot because I work with mixed groups of executives and leadership programs, and I'll tell a political joke, and all of the Europeans will go, hey, yeah, you know, show these, you know, like current, and the Americans literally sometimes will say, we didn't pay you to hear your political opinion. Very interesting and very strong, you know, kind of difference. Largely I would say a cultural difference. So, in any case, this is not working very well, is it? I think I'm going to change to this other system here. Hold on just for a second. That's all right. I have the thing set up on the other computer, so let me just pull it down from the other computer. Okay, so here we are. In one case, you can create a slow bisociation, and a slow bisociation is one where you bring the two frames of reference rather slowly together, and certain kinds of visual humor does that. When you do that, it generally creates a kind of a sense of irony or sort of mild amusement. Here's a joke. If you read Italian, you can read it, but for those of you who don't read Italian, it's a picture of in heaven of wings, and the caption is, "They're designed here, but we have them made in hell where the costs are lower." But it kind of creeps up on you, that one, a little bit. Here's one. This is just straight visual. So, the last pope on his departure. And usually these are not, for the most part, laugh out loud jokes. These are kind of. But if you make a here's another one. That's God and Steve Jobs having a selfie with their iPhone. So you notice here that at the gate there's an Apple computer. So if you make a faster bisociation, it generates more of a guffaw, kind of response. Here's one. See, you catch it? It's like once you get it, you go, ah, like that. It comes at you fast.
I love this one.
I'm particularly fond of this joke too.
Did you know this was a big question in Brazil because they were spying on us?
We're spying on everybody. Dad says you're spying on us online. He's not your dad. And here's one that translates to this is the woman and the man across the breakfast table, and she's saying, "At least Obama listens to me." So you see how that's different than the first ones. The first ones are kind of, and these are kind of jokes. So anyway, it's interesting to watch this. The implications for our work are not so much in jokes, although it is an interesting study on what kinds of jokes cross cultures and what kind of jokes don't cross cultures. Humor, inside group humor and outside group humor is another very interesting topic. We at our summer institute in Portland years ago, we tried to put a program on about inside humor. And so these would be groups, largely minority groups, within a society that use the stereotypes of the society in a humorous way within the group. So black people in the United States who might, who suffer in many cases from oppression associated with many of the original slavery positions, nevertheless within the group might be making a joke about that, and in one case, there was a program geared specifically towards African Americans, slave heritage African Americans, in which the slave ship was positioned as a travel, like a cruise ship, and people were in shackles but being given an orientation on the amenities of the cruise ship. And this was seen by people within the group as being very funny, but by people out. But typically that humor is not demonstrated to people outside the group, because people outside the group either don't understand it at all or take it to be politically incorrect. And that's what happened at our program. We thought, well, these are all sophisticated interculturalists. They'll understand that that's in-group humor, not out-group humor. That's not humor you laugh at as an outsider. But it's interesting to see that that's funny from an inside perspective, but it didn't work very well. I mean, basically, we as organizers of the conference were attacked for being politically incorrect, and so we didn't do it again. So, but that aside, moving on to some other applications of this for our work. When we are generating contexts or frame of references, what we're really doing is we're making distinctions. We're saying this and not that. We're creating a line. And this is George Spencer Brown in his book Laws of Form, who says that we cannot perceive anything without drawing a distinction, without making some kind of distinction. And the distinction that we make generates figure and ground. Basically what distinctions do is to tell us what to pay attention to. And I'm going to make the case here that culture is in many ways a system that tells us what to pay attention to. That culture creates figure and ground and says, pay attention to the figure, don't pay so much attention to the ground. And that different cultures do that in different ways. Such that when you go to a new culture and wish to interact in that new culture more competently, the main thing that you need to do is to learn what to pay attention to. That people in the other group pay attention to different things. And that the way that you learn how to pay attention to those other things is not just simply to say, oh, I need to pay attention to this and not to that, but it's rather to recreate your figure ground distinctions. You actually have to retool your perception to be able to perceive the world more in that way than in the way that you habitually do perceive the world. It's an interesting kind of perceptual and constructivist, by the way, approach to what it is that we need to do to adapt ourselves to operating in a different cultural context. So this is some of the foundation of that. We create figure and ground here, and the frame of reference then is determining what part of a distinction that you're going to pay attention to. With apologies to those of you who are just in the class, I'll ask you a question here. How many in the room have noticed what kind of shoes I have on? With apologies to people in the class, yes. For most of shoes, what kind of shoes I have on? For most of you, shoes are not figure. That the frame of reference that you use when you're looking at me, and all of you are looking at me, right? You can't see my shoes because I get them now. Yeah. But all of you are looking at me, but you're not paying attention to my shoes. If, however, you were a group of Italians, you almost certainly would have paid attention to my shoes. That for the most part, Italians believe that scarpe are part of your presentation of self, and how you're presenting yourself is being judged in terms of its appropriateness to the circumstance. And the term for that is figura. And you can either have a bella figura, which means that you're appropriate, or you can have a brutta figura, which means that you're not. Right? And that judgment is made typically on the basis of how you're clothed, what choices you've made about clothing, and particularly what kind of shoes you have on. It doesn't mean that they're expensive shoes or good shoes. It's like, are they appropriate? shoes, not only to the way you're dressed, but to the occasion. And other people, I'm assuming, in this case, Brazilians, for the most part don't do that. Americans don't do that for the most part. Germans, for the most part, as a national group, don't do that. You know, they're listening to what you say.
It's a positive
Right.
distribution.
Yeah, they might notice whether you have a tie on or not, you know, but they're not really, you know, they don't care really whether your shoes are coordinated with, you know, what you're wearing. But for Italians, careful now, don't go into stereotypes here. For Italians, this is not a superficial fashion consideration. This is a credibility issue. This is an issue every bit as important as, have I taken the trouble to understand what kind of an audience you are? But how I'm dressing just is another indication that I'm caring about you, and I'm caring about how I'm presenting myself to you. I invited a colleague of mine to come to Italy one time to give a speech. And I knew this, and so I said, bring your best suit. And so I suppose he did. But I forgot to tell him about the shoes, right? And so he had these just terrible clodhopper, big, nasty shoes. And really perfectly sophisticated academics came down afterwards, they came to me and said, well, what he said was kind of interesting, but did you see how he was dressed? You know, meaning it really did interfere with his credibility in the situation to have clearly not attended to that in that circumstance. Now, this is cultural, right? And this is not, those people are superficial and we're serious. This is a difference in what you're paying attention to. And for the most part, Italians tend to pay more attention to that than, I suspect, Brazilians do. On the other hand, Brazilians pay attention to different things. I think last time I was here, somebody said teeth.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
And I went, really? I said, yeah, teeth. That, you know, that part of this presentation of self is really the extent to which it looks like you have taken care of your teeth. You know, where I can assure you in many other circumstances, particularly British circumstances, it's absolutely not a factor. You know, the sort of Anglo diaspora, you know, what kind of teeth you have, you know, people might maybe notice it if like they were missing or something. But for the most part, that wouldn't be something people were paying attention to. And so you see, I mean, you can basically go through any culture. I'm just taking rather superficial examples here, but you know, in much more serious ways, say, pay attention to this, don't pay attention to that. Pay attention to this, don't pay attention to that. What you don't pay attention to is ground. What you do pay attention to is figure. And how cultures put that together are significantly different. And that, of course, has implications, then, doesn't it, for how it is that we learn ourselves to adapt to those cultural differences, and how we teach other people how to do that. So for those of us who are in the training or the education or the leadership development or whatever we're doing, if we're in that business and we're trying to say to somebody, here's what you need to do to get better, to be more competent in dealing in cross-cultural situations, well, it may be that we need to be spending some time on what to pay attention to. I would make that case anyway. So, one of the things we can do ourselves and suggest to others is that they practice shifting figure and ground. There's the traditional figure ground. I don't know, can you see?
I think we have to turn.
All right, turn that one off for the time, if you would, for the time being, sir. Thank you very much. Thanks. This is the traditional figure ground distinction. Here are the faces. There's the base in the middle. Here's another one of them where the background can be seen as the faces, and the figure is the inside is the figure. But when you look at the faces become the figure, and this becomes the ground. But if you look at this is the figure, and the black part is the ground. So shift back and forth. Can you do it?
Sure.
Yeah. Can you see them both at the same time?
Yeah.
No, you can't. No. That if we put you into an MRI, your brain state changes as you shift from one to the other. So what you're able to do, apparently, is to move back and forth rather quickly, but not to do it simultaneously. And this is important because the physiology of figure ground shifting means that you're inhibiting one condition while you are focusing on the other condition. And it's the focus inhibition, the juxtaposition of focus and inhibition, which allows you to move from one figure to the other. So I have a little bit of an exercise I'd like to do with you, just to practice this a little bit. And it involves putting the room in half, okay? And the exercise is going to be the influence of experience on what you notice, on what you pay attention to. Right? So on this half of the room, I want you to close your eyes when I say so, right? And this half of the room, you can leave your eyes open. I'm going to show you a picture for about 10 seconds. This picture is familiar, but don't get too much into its familiarity. Just sort of allow yourself to look at the picture. And then I'll ask you to close your eyes, and then you guys over here say open your eyes, and I'll show you another picture. And then I'll ask you to close your eyes so everybody's eyes is closed, and I'll show a third picture. And then when I say open your eyes, I want you to look at this third picture and tell me what you see first. Tell me what you see first, okay? I'm recreating a psychology laboratory experiment here. Okay? So, to begin with, this side of the room over here, close your eyes. This side of the room, keep your eyes open and look at this picture. Okay, just close your eyes on this hand. Other side of the room, open your eyes and look at this picture. Okay, close your eyes. Everybody have your eyes closed. And open your eyes and tell me the first thing you see.
A lady and a young lady and an old lady.
First thing you see. Yeah, not both things that you see. The first thing you see.
Old lady.
Old lady, young lady. Oh, you guys are such good subjects. Okay. The first picture that I showed was the old woman accentuated. See, so I've taken away the young woman cues and given just the old woman cues. That's what these people saw here. The second picture I showed was the young woman accentuated. I took away the old woman cues and gave just the young woman cues. Then I showed you the truly ambiguous picture that has both the young woman and the old woman cues. The old woman cues are the mouth here. The young woman cue is the eyelash and the feather up there. Yeah. The hypothesis is that if you see the old woman picture first, you will tend to see the old woman in this picture. And if the picture were not familiar to you, I might be able, just in 10 seconds, to bias your perception sufficiently that you really couldn't see the other set of cues. And then likewise, I can show you the young woman, and you tend to see that. Now, because you're familiar with the picture, you probably know how to shift back and forth anyway. But even then, when I say, what do you see first, it was pretty systematic that you saw the old one first, you saw the young one first. Is that interesting? 10 seconds. I showed you that picture for 10 seconds. Imagine what happens in 10 years. You know, where we are constantly encouraged to pay attention to one thing and not to something else. What we're doing, what's happening to us in a culture is we are being heavily indoctrinated into organizing our perception in a particular way. If it is the case that cultures encourage different organizations of perception, that's why it's difficult for us to recognize, to perceive things in a different cultural way, because we habitually have learned how to make certain figure ground distinctions. So it's the loosening of that up and allowing ourselves to reconfigure that is one of the basic skills of learning how to do intercultural communication. Interesting? Yeah, that's it. There's by the way, that's another one of the sort of, in some ways, more difficult one to do that shift on.
Yeah.
Was it, you know, if you pay attention to your body, what does it feel like when you move back and forth? Can you do it? Can you move back and forth between the young woman and the old woman? What, can you feel the shift in your body when you do that? Makes you dizzy a little bit? Sometimes it makes you feel almost a little queasy. You know what queasy is? Like a little nauseous, you know, in your stomach. Yeah, a little uncomfortable to make that shift back and forth. Do you recognize that feeling from any other thing that you do in your life? This particular feeling? That little feeling of nausea, or sort of, you know, 'cause it's kind of a disorientation that you have, might be, you know, you might feel it as dizziness or something as well. Pay attention when you go into new situations, unfamiliar situations. When you move from a familiar to an unfamiliar situation, a lot of people report a very similar feeling of that sort of, just a little bit of an incipient nausea, you know, meaning sort of the beginnings of the feeling of sickness. And usually it goes away pretty fast. But it seems to be a common concomitant, it's commonly associated with the shifting of perception. So when you go into an unfamiliar situation, your brain is trying to organize that new situation in some kind of accessible way. It's trying to figure out what's going on there. What we usually do, of course, is to organize that in a familiar way, a way that we already know. But of course, the work that we do is to try to allow ourselves to reorganize our perception in the way that people in that other group are doing it. You know, in other words, to participate in the different cultural experience. So this is getting hold of the feeling and practicing these shifts is in fact loosening up our perception. It's exercising really our perceptual flexibility, and thus making it easier for us to make that shift if we know what to shift from and to. You know, it's a little kind of self-awareness part that's necessary here. So, let me extend this idea to the notion of contextual intelligence. I don't really like the term intelligence. I think it's a reification, meaning that, you know, I doubt that there is such a thing as intelligence. I think it's an idea that has been made up to explain how people respond to certain kinds of tests. And if you're interested in the argument for that, it's made by a guy named Stephen Jay Gould, who's a biologist, an American biologist, well-known, published a lot of books. And he has a book called The Mismeasure of Man. And in that book, he talks about various ways that we've tried to figure out why people are the way they are. Like phrenology, for instance. You know, you've got these bumps on your head, and you know, people are the way they are because they have certain kinds of bumps. And he thinks that intelligence is like that. That it's an idea that we've made up to try to explain why people are different. But in fact, we don't actually have something like intelligence. It's just an idea that we've made up to try to explain a difference. So anyway, with that caveat, again, on intelligence, this particular study that was done, we use the term contextual intelligence. I'm using the notion here that if you have a set of these distinctions, it generates a context. And in a rather important study done by Harvard Business School, which was called the Harvard Leadership Initiative, a study was done of 860 innovative business leaders in the 20th and 21st century. Actually looked at the criteria that were used in selecting these leaders, and they were pretty good. I mean, the basic one was they'd never been thrown in jail. But in addition to that, they had been successful in their companies. They were written about positively in the media, And in other ways, it looked like the selection criteria were pretty good for what constituted these innovative business leaders. And they weren't all Americans, although they weren't, I don't think, representative of a global mix, but they weren't all Americans, so there was at least a little bit of cultural mix in it. And what they found, as usual, is that there were no personality characteristics in common. I'm sure you all know that there is no personality of a leader. There is no leadership personality. And people keep looking for it. It's like the Holy Grail. They keep saying there must be some set of characteristics that constitute a good leader, so that we could select for those characteristics, or we could train people in those characteristics. But in fact, every study of this type that collects people who in fact have been successful in leadership does not find a correlation of personality characteristics. As an aside, let me say I think that's also true for good intercultural communicators. There is no personality of a good intercultural communicator. They're not nice people, or not nice people. They're not even open-minded people, or not open-minded people. They're not particularly intelligent or unintelligent people. They're people who know how to do perceptual shifting, which by the way, is what it is that these people know how to do. That the characteristic that was shared by these business leaders is an ability to identify trends by context, an ability to shift context and to synthesize across contexts. That's out of the thing there, but a shared ability to recognize context, to shift context, and to synthesize across context. In other words, these people looked a lot like good intercultural communicators. And believe me, that's not what Harvard Business School was looking for. Harvard Business School has no idea what intercultural communication is. It's not part of their curriculum. But what they discovered by sort of accidentally discovering this about entrepreneurs is that what they discovered is what I think is probably the basic skill that that drives intercultural communication. And don't you think it's interesting that that also seems to be a basic skill for innovative business leadership? For those of you who might be looking for an argument for why businesses should be teaching intercultural communication or training intercultural communication, is, well, in doing so, they may be training exactly the skills that are also useful for being a good entrepreneur, for being a good leader in this context. Is that a good idea or what?
It's a very good argument.
Yeah, no, it's an unassailable argument. I mean, unless you want to attack the Harvard study, which you really shouldn't. I mean, this was a well-conducted study and it's done by credible people, right? So, unless you want to attack the study, I mean, basically, what they found here of this recognize context, shift context, and synthesize is precisely what we call cultural self-awareness, recognition of other cultures and the ability to take perspective or empathize across cultures, and the ability to learn from that cross-cultural experience how to look at things or do things in a new or innovative way. That's what we teach. It's what we've been teaching traditionally for years. That's what Edward T. Hall was talking about in 1955. So this is a very, very nice point of connection, I think, between what we do and the business world. There's another connection that, and this is going into the neuroscience. That was more of a psychology study. This is more of a neuroscientific study of bilingualism, and by extension, biculturalism. The study itself is looking at people who are speaking more than one language. But in almost all cases, those people are also operating in two different cultural contexts. So, I think the one probably generalizes to the other. And the notion here is that the ability to shift between these two languages or cultural contexts is seen to affect the so-called executive functions of the brain, executive function. So this is what neuroscientists these days are calling the coordinating function of the brain. What they're saying is that the brain is a complex structure of input and output, but that there are certain centers of the brain that seem to be nodes, or areas in which there is all of these inputs come into there, and there are a whole bunch of inputs and outputs that go into these nodes, and those nodes or areas seem to be coordinating areas. So one of the major functions of the brain is to coordinate the input and output of stimuli. So not a dramatically new idea, I don't think, but it's, you know, there's more and more evidence that that's a major function of the brain. It's called executive function. So, in this particular study that I'm quoting, which is Wu and Thierry, it's from 2013, so it's pretty current. The study is called Fast Modulation of Executive Function by Language Context in Bilinguals, and what they found, this is a quote from that, and let me kind of try to translate it. The mixed language context shifted the executive system to an enhanced functional level. Okay, let me translate that. That when they looked at people who could speak more than one language, it appeared that those people had an executive function, a coordinating function, that was operating faster and better than people who only spoke one language. Thus improving the effectiveness of nonverbal conflict resolution. So what they were doing is they were presenting people with two different pictures and seeing how long it took for them to figure out how to see one or the other or put them together. And that this has implications for functional plasticity. Functional plasticity is the ability to shift perspective. You know, essentially perspective taking, right? Process by which new skills and life experiences modify brain structure and function. So what they're saying essentially here is that the ability to shift perspective is how you learn stuff. And specifically, the ability to shift perspective into a different culture is how it is that you learn to get along better in that culture. And what they're saying here is that bilingual people are better at doing this basic thing. Not surprising, I suppose. But we can look at this as operating in two directions. On the one hand, we can say bilingual, bicultural people are better at doing this. But on the other hand, we can say if we want people to be better bilingual and bicultural, just basically better at adapting to another culture, we should be teaching these things that the bilingual people apparently are doing well, you know, which is this sort of plastic, fast shifting function. And it turns out, and we can, in our work, use some of the perceptual tricks that I was showing you earlier to teach this. So some additional research on this. This is in a psycholinguistics article showing that bilingual, and again, typically bicultural children are better at shifting to operate by new rules. That bilingual children are better at focusing their attention. That means inhibiting distraction. So the way you focus your attention, I'm going to attend to you, I have to inhibit looking at the rest of these people here. And if I want to pay attention to them, I have to inhibit you and pay attention to them. I can't, any more than seeing the vase and the faces, I can't see both them and you at the same time. You know, I have to move back and forth. So if we're having a conversation and they're having a kind of interesting side conversation, you know, they're saying, do you believe what she did? You know, and we're having a conversation too. I actually, and I want to listen to what they're saying. I keep looking at you and pretending like I'm listening to you, but actually I'm not hearing anything you're saying because I've shifted my focus over to them to hear what she really did, right? And I've inhibited this conversation so that when I come back, I have to pretend like I was listening to what you said, but you know, all that sort of thing. So what do you think about this? And you say, well, I just told you. But in fact, I didn't hear it because I was paying attention over here. That's inhibition. That's focus and inhibition. And it turns out that we all of us do that to some extent, but bilingual kids are particularly good at doing that. So since most of you in this room are bilingual, what it means is you are particularly good at inhibiting distraction while you focus on something. A practical implication of this is you should not talk on the telephone while you're driving. I mean, you get a fine, but the reason why that's illegal now in most countries in the world is because it has been found that in general, when people talk on the phone, they inhibit their awareness of the road. They focus on the telephone conversation, and in so doing, their brain shuts down the visual representation of the road. And so you think you're looking at the road, kind of like I'm pretending to be listening to you, but in fact you're not seeing what's going on there. And if you're bilingual, you're particularly good at not seeing what's going on out there on the road. Yeah. So you in this room particularly should not talk on the phone while you're driving. Yeah. Also, let me tell, and this is okay, I'm sorry, I'm telling just a little bit of a story out of school here, so to speak. But Enos came to me, okay, good, I can tell the story about it. She came to me earlier and said, you know, we're a little late in getting the name tags done. And I'm wondering if you would mind during the class, this was yesterday during the class, if some people started cutting out the name tags. And I said, and she said, people will be able to multitask and they'll be able to listen. And I said, well, I know women. Yeah. And I said, knowing this research, I said, no, I don't think it's a very good idea. Because I really think that people, when they're cutting out name tags, are not actually paying attention to what's going on. They may be able to shift back and forth between the two, but particularly if they're bilinguals, and of course, you know, that's who was in the class, because they could understand me, you know, that they would not be able to pay attention to those things. So when we claim to multitask, we probably are not. What we're doing is shifting back and forth at best, but you're not paying attention to both things simultaneously. And even if you're a woman, apparently there are not, at this level, there are not big gender differences. In some other areas, they've found some gender differences on that. But in terms of these bilingual children, there are no differences between boys and girls. So don't talk on the phone while you're driving. What this little finding is showing is that it looks like the bilingualism itself is what's affecting the executive control, not culture, language, gender, by the way, immigration status, or other kinds of things that might have been affecting that. So it was just, they did some nice controls in these studies to show that it appeared to be the ability to shift language frame of reference rather than other cultural factors here. And this is kind of interesting for possibly some of us in the room. And that is that this ability apparently is a lifelong, it has lifelong advantages. Yeah.
I would like to ask you if there is a difference in being bilingual since you were little, or if you learn the language older. You have the benefits the same way, or?
Very interesting, and the answer is it looks like the benefits kick in even when you become bilingual later in life. So this is not something that you only have the 3-year or the 7-year window and then too bad. Is that if you in fact get really good at this later, that it looks like it has a similar effect in the way that you in your brain processing. Isn't that interesting? You know, so yeah. It's kind of like the studies that show that our neurons, every time you have a drink, you know, remember we used to think that if you had a glass of wine, you know, that you killed 50 million neurons and they would never grow back, you know. But it turns out they actually do grow back, you know. And in this case, you know, it's not just that early window. There is a window where it's easy to learn languages for kids. You know, they can learn hundreds of languages, and later on in life, it's not so easy, trust me. But if you do take the time and trouble to learn another language, or I believe another culture. So I think this extends to culture learning. It's not just language learning, it's changing perspective. It's shifting frame of reference. It's the bisociation issue that we're dealing with here. So when you learn later in life just how to get along well in another culture, you in fact are kicking off some of these things. You know, you're improving your chance of not getting Alzheimer's disease. In case you're looking for another argument for why it is that learning intercultural learning. Want to avoid Alzheimer's? Well, come to our training.
It seems that learning to play piano is the same effect, at least for Alzheimer.
Yeah. Well, and it could be that what we're looking at is learning how to do anything that is different, that demands that you organize your perception differently, maybe having certain effects.
Well, except with Finnish though.
Well, nobody learns Finnish. Okay, so when we apply this, as I've been suggesting, when we apply this to intercultural communication, let me make a couple of statements about this. Intercultural communication is not about culture, it's about communication. And we spend a lot of time sometimes in this field talking about culture. You know, I mean, that's interesting, but the fact is that if we're trying to get people to be better at dealing with those cultures, it's a communication issue, it's not a culture issue. We know that people can know a lot about another culture and not be able to communicate very well in that culture. They could be experts in the history of Japan and not know how to get along with Japanese people. And many diplomats, for instance, or people who come out of international studies programs, in fact, are quite knowledgeable about the political systems and economic and historical systems of other societies, but in fact are not very good at communicating with people. You can even know the language of a place and not be very good at communicating with people who speak it. I wrote an article years ago about that called How to Not Be a Fluent Fool. So you learn the language, but you don't learn its use in social context, and so you get into more trouble than if you didn't know the language in the first place. So if we think about culture, about intercultural communication as communication, we can then define that as the coordination of meaning and action. When we communicate with somebody else, what we're doing is we're attempting to coordinate meaning, which is, hey, here's what I mean, and we're trying to negotiate that with the other person. And typically the reason that we are trying to do that is to coordinate our actions in some way. You know, like, where are we going to go after dinner? Well, what do you mean by dinner? Is that what you have at lunchtime, or is that what you have at supper time? So we coordinate the meaning of that, and then but the reason for doing that is to try to decide then where we're going to go. So we're trying to coordinate our action. This led Edward T. Hall to say that essentially what culture does is to give us some rules for how to do that, for how to coordinate meaning and action within a group of people. And so he, in case you don't know, this is the person who's generally attributed with founding the field of intercultural communication. Silent language is the major text created, which he, by the way, he created for the purpose of training business people on how to get along better in a variety of other cultures. Edward T. Hall was an anthropologist, but what stimulated him to create the field of intercultural communication was because he was trying to figure out how to use anthropology to help business people get along better in cross-cultural situations. And they said, we don't have time to become anthropologists. And he said, well, yeah, that's right. And so he contacted his other friends, one of whom was Gregory Bateson, who was a specialist an anthropologist, but also a specialist in communication. And together with him and a guy named Traeger, who was a linguist, they put together this system, which we now call intercultural communication, which in fact is a system for applying knowledge of cultural differences into a communication context that in fact helps people to get along better. Anyway, He had the definition of communication as the essence of culture. Culture, in fact, is how to communicate. Consequently, intercultural communication, that is communication across cultural contexts, is a kind of meta-communication. It's the coordination of coordinating systems. So here you have coordinating system A, Brazil. Here you have coordinating system B, US American. Or we could be more specific, Sao Paulo and New York, you know, however you want to define the cultural boundary, right? But let's say Brazil and US America. So you've got two different coordinating systems. What we're really trying to get people to do is to generate a meta-coordinating system. That is a way of moving between coordinating system A and coordinating system B so as to operate successfully to some extent in both of them, but also to derive value from synthesizing across those contexts. That's what business people call the value of diversity, or the potential value of diversity. So if you want to be good at this, which I'm calling competent intercultural communication, if you want to be good at it, there are two things that we need to do with that. One of them is we need to have so-called perceptual acuity. That's the ability to make distinctions, the ability to be flexible in the way that we make these figure ground distinctions, so that when you go to Italy, you can start noticing shoes. But that when you come to Brazil, you start noticing teeth. You know, and you need to be able to shoot. But you don't want to spend too much time on teeth in Italy. And you probably don't want to spend too much time on shoes in Brazil. Right? So you want to be able to be flexible with shifting back and forth. And this, of course, part of this is to be able to recognize how you, in your own culture, do this. Because if you don't know how you do it, then you don't know how that's different than how somebody else is doing it. So we call that cultural self-awareness. And that's kind of like the beginning point of it. And then you need to be able to look at other people in complex ways, other cultural groups. You can't say we're really complex and they're simple. That's generally referred to as stereotype. You know, so if you have stereotypes of other cultures, it means that you're perceiving them in simple ways, and much of our job is to try to complexify the perception that we have of other cultures, because only if we perceive them as in complex ways can we then shift into the distinctions, into the figure ground distinctions that are being made in that context, in the alternative context. And then the second key is perceptual agility, which is this ability to shift back and forth, the ability to change perspective. You can do that by learning how to change perspective linguistically. So bilingualism seems to be associated with being good at this. And the goal of this is to be able to experience the world in this other way. So when we're teaching people how to go to the U.S., let's say, they want to go conduct business in someplace in the U.S., it's not going to help much to learn about U.S. economic systems. It might be interesting, but it's not going to be really terribly useful. It's not going to be terribly useful for them to learn about the history of the conquering of the West. It's not even necessarily going to be useful for them to learn English. But that's necessary, and it could be useful because you can apply the linguistic code shifting to cultural code shifting. But what they need to be able to do is to experience the world more like an American. That's what's going to allow them to be successful in the U.S., is to experience the world more as if they were American. In the same way that coming to Brazil, the key to being successful here is to be able to experience the world more as if you were Brazilian in sort of a general sense. It doesn't mean you could become Brazilian or become American or become Japanese, wherever you're going. It means that you're able to experience the world as if. So when you notice my shoes now? Yeah. When you notice my shoes, you are experiencing the world, you're organizing the world as if you're more Italian. And that will allow you to do like good things in Italy, like dress appropriately for the meeting that you're gonna have there. And believe me, if you don't, it's gonna make a difference. Just like when you come here to Brazil, you should brush your teeth.
On the course, everybody noticed your shoes.
Yeah, in the course, yeah, well, that's right, yeah, because they were good at shifting, maybe. That's right. Also, it was a little easier to observe, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
everybody, yes.
Yeah, I know, it's, I'm just playing around with it. Okay, you have some kind of question? I have a little bit more I want to show you about how this plays out through the developmental sequence. But let me stop at this point, because this has been sort of a lot of stuff already, to see if there's some clarification or some other kind of question that you might have, or argument that I'd be happy to hear. Yeah? Melissa.
One of the questions I had, if I can wait until 4 o'clock, is
We have a little bit of time now.
is the notion of context. So when we talk about context, we can talk about immediate interpersonal context, we can talk about the event context, we can talk about, and you kind of said, but it was as an aside, maybe you don't have to know historical context of the U.S. or that sort of thing. But actually, in my work, one of the things that we talk a lot about is that knowing historical context is very important oftentimes. Not always, what actually is relevant for a context can be very important. So in East Asia, for example, in Taiwan, understanding the historical context of the relations between Taiwan and mainland China, between the so-called mainlanders who came over in 1949 versus ethnic Chinese from before that period of time. So it seems that this, I really like the idea of the perceptual acuity and the perceptual agility, and having that, and having that self-awareness and that perception of alternative context. Part of that's alternative historical, political, economic context, as well as fashion context or other communicative factors. It might become clearer when I have my examples.
Well, yeah, but as you might imagine, I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
So let me try to make a little bit of a response, and we can certainly come back to it. This is an important question. Let me start out by putting it in kind of political terms. In many ways, what I said was a political statement. By political, it means it was a statement of preference for doing things in one way versus the other. And I believe that in this field of intercultural relations, we don't err, we don't do too much on the side of teaching people to communicate better. But we do frequently do too much on the side of giving people information about historical, economic, and political contexts, on the assumption that that will translate into more effective behavior in the other culture. We err a lot in that direction, because this is what universities do, and this has been the basis of international programs, et cetera, et cetera. And so, but the political statement I was making in many ways is we shouldn't pay as much attention as we frequently have to that, and we should be paying more attention to this other thing that we haven't been paying as much attention to, and that is the way in which we're organizing our perceptual experience of the world. So that's the political response to what you're saying. I would say the more sort of substantive, theoretical response is that if you had to choose, let's just create the thought problem of here you got two people coming into the office of a Chinese business guy, and those people are both of them soliciting a relationship with that business person. One of them exclusively knows about the history of Taiwan and other important Chinese historical issues, and let's say really well, but doesn't know anything about perceptual shifting or operating in that context. The other guy doesn't know anything about that historical context, but in fact is pretty good at shifting perceptual structure and knows what to pay attention to in a Chinese context, and is like on to issues like Guanxi and other sorts of things like that that don't necessarily exist in historical context. Which one's likely to be more successful? And the answers might be neither of them, both of them, this guy more, this guy more. I guess my bias would be towards the perceptual acuity person. That person can better compensate for not knowing the history than the history person can compensate for not being able to take the perspective in the cultural context that he's working. So
Yes,
that
I think
leads me
for
to
me,
bias.
rather than an either or, it's sort of disintegrated, and knowing which is most relevant in a particular interaction.
Yeah, and of course the ideal.
That it can shift from moment to moment.
The ideal is everybody who goes into another culture knows the historical context, speaks the language fluently, and has these perception shifting abilities. That, of course, that's ideal. But those people are pretty dramatically bilingual, bicultural people. They certainly exist. But the original problem that Edward T. Hall had was he didn't have time to work with people to that level. That he had a week or 2 weeks or something like that with these business people who were in turn going to go out and deal in a variety of cultural contexts. They weren't just going to China. And so he was extremely limited in how much historical information that they were likely to retain anyway, that he could give to them about the 6 different places that they were going to be going in the next year. And so it was addressing those issues really that generated this notion of intercultural communication in more communication terms rather than in the traditional knowledge terms. But we'll continue on that one.
I think the
That's
perceptual
response.
acuity thing fits well with Michael Agar's point about rich points, that when something happens that you're not following what's going on, that there seems to be some sort of point of tension or something that instead of seeing that as an irritant, seeing it as a rich point, there's something I'm not getting here.
Yeah.
And what I'm not getting here might be historical context, say, in Belgium, between French and Dutch, or use of French and Dutch, depending on where it is. And so just being keyed into that, you can't know everything, but what is it that I might not be knowing, which might be useful.
Always good. And of course, ideally, we set ourselves up to learn that,
Right.
so that we don't come in armed with a, compendium of
Right,
encyclopedic knowledge, but that we know how to pay attention to the right things, which in a way is an application of this, but to historical context.
Maybe one comment, when business people have to deal with 20 nations, with 20 different cultures at the same time, it is not at all helpful for them to have, or they don't have even the time to get to know all the history or these much of information. And therefore I think it's very, very interesting to have a little bit deeper the link between the leadership competence and the cultural competence, or competent intercultural communicators and competent leaders.
But, you hear the point she's making though, which is, that there are things that probably are problematic if you don't know them. I was just in China recently doing a course at Peking University, just like last month. And there were 2 Taiwanese women in the class along with the PRC, largely PRC people. And as I was giving examples of treatment of minority groups, I was, in some examples, I was, from time to time, I was bringing up Tibet. And as far as I know, there were no Tibetans in the room. And so while people were kind of quiet, they nevertheless were not pushing back at me about that. But I didn't mention Taiwan, because I happen to know that. And also the Taiwanese women were becoming particularly quiet, as that topic. And I noticed that, and I knew they were from Taiwan. And I noticed that, and I'm like, don't think I'll bring up Taiwan in this context. And sure enough, afterwards they came up to me and said, this is a very touchy issue here. I said, well, yeah, I do actually know that. And they said, so thank you for not bringing it up, because it would have been very awkward and embarrassing for us had you brought that up. Right? So that would be a situation where either somebody could have been paying attention and saying, something's up here that I better pay attention to, or it would be useful to have come in with that knowledge. So both, you know, we can make it, you can easily think of examples, but on the other hand, you go into 6 places in the next 6 months, you know, you're not going to be able to be too encyclopedic in what you know about it. Anybody else? A comment or question? Okay, you want me to go back into delivery mode here?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so again, with apologies to those of you who are familiar with this, but let me try to put it into this the context, this new context that I'm making. This is my idea about how people get better at this. And the interesting thing about this model, it's a model of becoming more interculturally sensitive. It's really about perception. It's about how it is that you become more agile, you know, more acute and more agile in the way that you handle perception. It's not about how much you know. It's not about what kind of attitude you have. And it's not about even what kind of skills you have. It's about how you can shift your perception. And this model, first published in 1986, has, I can say, I'm sorry, kind of immodestly, but to say that it's been robust. That's what that means is nobody's come up with a better one. You know, it continues to be used as a way of organizing education and training and research in intercultural. And I guess I have to say the reason for that is because it's hitting at a very basic thing about shifting cultures, and that is it's really about shifting our perceptual organization. It's not about what we know. It's not even about what kind of attitude you have. It doesn't care whether you like other people or don't like other people. It doesn't care a whole lot about how much you know about other people. What it really cares about is how good are you at shifting your perceptual organization into some complex alternative system. And that complexity might include things like historical context. But how good are you at shifting into some alternative complex? And people who are not very good at all, we call ethnocentric. It's because they organize the world in their own cultural way, but they're really not very good at organizing it outside of that way. And people who are pretty good at organizing things in other ways as well as their own, we call ethno-relative. Well, I call them ethno-relative. Nobody else uses this term. If you Google ethno-relative now, it actually brings up a bunch of stuff. So it could be that that term is catching on as a piece of jargon. So ethnocentric is experiencing your culture as if it's the only one, or as if it's sort of central to reality. And ethno-relative is experiencing your culture as being one of other cultures which you might be able to experience as well. So people who are particularly bad at this, I call in denial. And by being in denial about cultural difference, it means that you're failing to perceive the existence or the relevance of other cultural ways of organizing things. And a lot of people we work with are like that. You know, you go into somebody and say, I want to talk to you about intercultural communication, and they say, we don't care about culture. You know, we build chips. Chips don't care about culture. Chips, you know, like you know, computer chips, you know, or, you know, we build tractors. You know, tractors don't care. We treat diseases. Diseases don't care about culture. And, you know, there are a whole lot of excuses for why it is that people don't care about culture. But basically what they're saying is we don't think it's important to shift our perception into anything outside of what we already know. If you talk to those people about cultural difference sufficiently, it brings them into a position of defense, you know, where they say, okay, well, we see that there are other cultures and they're probably bad. Yeah, so you bring the other into relief, and yet then it leads to a polarization or a negative evaluation of the other group. You see them as threatening in some ways. But think about it. If you think about it for a minute, if you don't think about other people at all, they're not threatening. But when you start thinking about them in simplistic ways, they can easily become threatening. That's what happens. And then the resolution of that is to generate this very interesting position of minimization. And in minimization, what we're doing is we're focusing on the common human experience. So as to move out of defense, we move into this idea that deep down, everybody is pretty much the same. So you got these differences, you got these little differences. They could be historical differences, they could be language differences, they could be other differences. But deep down, we all share some basic human characteristics. And some of that is 2 arms, 2 legs, eat, sleep, eat and sleep, well, okay, fair enough. But beyond that, the people at this point here, because it's still an ethnocentric position, people here tend to assume that people share some underlying values, basic values, and usually they're called human values. And it's interesting to see who defines human values. And that the universal human values tend to be defined in terms of whoever it is that is, creating the system of universal human values. It's kind of a colonialist thing, or at least imperialist kind of idea, where people who are Christian, for instance, say deep down, whether you know it or not, God loves you. But if you're Hindu, you say deep down, whether you know it or not, you have karma. Or if you're Marxist, you say deep down, whether you know it or not, you're subject to class-based economic forces. Or if you're a right-wing American these days, you say deep down, whether you know it or not, you want to be an individual entrepreneur. You want to live in a market-driven economy, preferably an oligarchy, but we'll call it a democracy. This tends to be, the way I define this is you're using familiar categories to organize difference. So you say, oh, yeah, it's different, but I'm going to understand that difference in familiar terms. So you're not really shifting your perceptual organization. You're acknowledging the difference, but you're saying deep down this is really organized in a familiar way. A way that, by the way, corresponds to my familiar way of looking at the world. This has been one of the great contributions to this model, I must say. Because hardly, before this model, nobody had defined that particular function of ethnocentrism. And so everybody was moving from, and we still do, by the way, move from defense to minimization. People get the Nobel Peace Prize for going from here to here. They don't get the Nobel Peace Prize for becoming ethno-relative. Everybody knows what that is. But everybody knows that if you hate somebody else and discover that they're basically human and therefore seem to not hate them as much, or maybe don't kill them as much, that that's a good thing. And so people, we give them the prize. Sometimes we give it to them preemptively, like Obama, but then it turns out not. The problem with this yeah, well, most of you are not Americans, right? Well, some of you are. And you can just see her saying, I didn't pay to hear your point.
I don't work for the weapons
So, no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding you. Thanks for allowing yourself to be a foil here.
Melissa is from California also.
Oh, well then, so that's not really American.
Let's just say I didn't vote for Mitt Romney.
No, neither did I. All right. So the problem, one of the problems with this position, by the way, is it's unstable. So people who come into saying we're all basically human, if somebody turns out to be different enough to fall out of that familiar category, we say, well, except for them. and we should kill them. You know, but everybody else is kind of basically human, but those people, it's okay to kill them. So there's a shift out of minimization back to defense that leads us to sort of oscillate back and forth here. I think philosophically our work as interculturalists is to move people beyond this point here. And I think this point, this big line here, represents the barrier to shifting our perceptual organization. It represents the difficulty that has been created by being told for 10 or 20 or 30 or more years, here's what you should pay attention to. The difficulty in learning how to pay attention to something different. It's an act of consciousness. It's an act of self-reflexive consciousness, an act of seeing ourselves doing something and thereby saying, but we could do it differently. It's a difficult thing to do.
It hurts.
It hurts, and it makes you sick. I mean, you know, it gives you that nausea, you know, of changing perspective. And there are other things that are difficult about this, and it's easy to just kind of hang out here and go, well, it's a small world after all. It's a small world sorry. You know, we are the world. And, you know, it's easy to hang out here and just feel good. But we're not doing anything very productive. You know, we're not delivering what we're promising. That if we are interculturalists and we say we're going to help you get along in another culture, if we say, and what you need to do is to just recognize that everybody's basically the same and we are the world, you're not delivering. I mean, it's false advertising. That what we need to be doing is moving at least, I think, to a position of saying, those people, whoever they are, that other group, that other context that we're trying to shift into, is as complex as this context. And here's how it's different. This context is complex in this way, and that context over there is complex in that way. U.S. Americans are complex in this and this and this ways. Brazilians are complex in this and this and this ways. Never mind the different distinctions you could make within Brazil or within the United States, you know, around socioeconomic class or region or gender or other kinds of ways of distinguishing culture. But in all of these cases, the other group is as complex as your group, and this is where that kicks in, that assumption of complexity, and that's what in turn allows for the adaptation. So this is what we advertise here. We advertise that we will help you to adapt to another culture. Well, and what we mean is you'll be able to generate appropriate and authentic alternative behavior. So we're not going to send you to China and pretend to be Chinese, because Chinese people won't like that. You know, they'll say, you know, stop trying to act like you're Chinese, and appropriately so. And aside, I once had a group of Japanese people, apologies to the class, a group of Japanese people say to me, when you talk to Americans, could you please ask them not to bow? Bow. Not to bow. And I said, okay, but why not? And they said, because it's so painful to watch. And I said, okay. And so I did. And I said, why is it painful? Because they don't do it right. And we would prefer to have them not do it at all, or shake hands, or do whatever they know how to do, than to try to bow incorrectly. I said, okay. So I started telling Americans, don't bow when you go to Japan. You know, but meanwhile, I was observing some gaijin, you know, Americans or you know, people from other European places. I was observing that some of them, in fact, were bowing and appeared to be, you know, interacting perfectly well with Japanese people who were bowing back. So I started asking both the Japanese and the gaijin, the non-Japanese in this case, how do you know how to bow correctly? You see what I'm asking? I'm saying, what do you need to pay attention to? And they said, oh, you need to pay attention to the relative status of the person, of the two people who are bowing. So it's not just the person who's being bowed to that you need to know that person's status, but you need to know your own status, and then you need to understand in that context what the difference in that status is, and then you need to know how to represent that status difference in the depth of the bow and the amount of eye contact that you make while you do it. And I said, oh, so most people can't do that, right? Unless you're born into it. They said, yeah, right, it's really hard to do. But you could learn to do it, and the way you learn to do it is you pay attention to that. So now I start telling my audiences, don't bow unless you can feel a relative status difference between yourself and the other person. And that's more than just knowing what their status is, that's knowing what your status is relative to them. And
From a Japanese point of view.
yeah, when you're in Japan, I'm just talking about Japan now.
From a Japanese point of view.
CC, yeah, that is what their idea of the relative status is, right? Not what your idea of the relative status is. And then, I say, then you have to learn what the actual physical movement is that's going to represent that. But never mind the physical movement, if you can't feel the status difference, don't do it. That's what we mean by authentic behavior. Authentic alternative behavior is behavior that's based on the ability to feel what's correct. We call it the feeling of appropriateness. And that's how we generate appropriate behavior in our own culture, is because it feels right to do it that way. So what we're really asking people to do is to shift into the feeling structure of the other culture, essentially the perceptual structure of the other cultures, so as to feel things more the way they're being felt there, and then to be able to represent that feeling with appropriate behavior. That's what we're asking people to do. And when we advertise that we're going to help you be more effective in the other culture, we're really basically saying we're going to help you to do that. So then the next question is, are we really helping people to do that? Or are we doing something else? And hoping that it ends up like that. So then if you get really good at this, it leads to what I call integration, including cultural context in decision making, acting, what I call contextual ethical commitment. You know, one of the issues that comes up here is, if you're organizing the world in the way that another culture does, that includes organizing it in terms of some values that you may disagree with. You know, so if you want to communicate with Americans, for instance, it would be a good idea for you not just to know the history of capital punishment, but to be able to feel capital punishment as a good thing. Because Americans organize the world for the most part in such a way, and maybe not in California, but in such a way that capital punishment is experienced. You know, this is the state killing people. Okay, that is experienced as an appropriate punishment for certain kinds of crimes, and in many cases a deterrent to other people. Never mind the data on that. You know, but it's experienced as a deterrent for other people to do that. And if you want to talk to Americans in some way that might include a topic like that, you need to be able to feel. This is really weird now. You need to be able to feel the goodness of capital punishment. Now, the ethical question is, assuming that you don't actually think it's good, how could you do that and still maintain your ethical commitment, which may be against that? It's really complicated. It's complicated. I mean, come to the class next year, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about that. But, you know, it really. But it's a very, very complex issue, and could be, but the history without the perceptual shift is not going to help, because you can know the history of a place and be making all kinds of ethnocentric judgments about that. So the history could help if you've got somebody who's operating at this stage of development. It's just that we give history to people down there and figure that it's going to help them do this when it really doesn't. That was kind of the position I was taking. Yeah.
I was just thinking, sometimes I think this is a little frustrating about our job, because I've been living 16 years in Brazil, and being German, I'm somewhere between acceptance and integration maybe, but I'm still not fully integrated, and you know, you try to pass that on to somebody in one-day training,
or an hour.
You know, how do you do that if we ourselves sometimes haven't achieved
And even if you were operating in integration, meaning that you habitually shifted your organization of the world, which, you really might be habitually shifting, even then, it's difficult to pass that on, as you say, to somebody in a relatively short period of time. Because assuming that you're dealing with other people who typically are at best at this position here, and frequently in one of these positions down here, you really need to move them through this position of recognizing the complexity of the other culture before they can then start doing this kind of frame shifting business, and there's some perceptual flexibility issues that need to be dealt with. And essentially, you're dealing with, in my experience, minimally, for this shift from here to here, minimally 30 contact hours spread over several months. Minimum. Yeah, and that's really focused time. Contact hours means that you probably are running 3 sets of 2-day programs over a period of some months so that people have a chance to absorb and process what it is that you're doing, something like that. So that'd be 3 times 12, 36 hours, something like that. And I've seen some reasonably successful movements from here to here with that kind of input. But anything less than that, and you're dealing with some kind of a compromise, and even then, it's tough to keep the focus to make that kind of a shift. So, yeah, mostly we are thrown into situations where we don't have enough time to deliver on what it is that we're promising.
You might, though, get someone who's hitting the ground running.
Could be.
They're coming already with some sort of more adaptive skills, maybe.
Sure. The more you can select people, or if you're lucky, get people who are operating in these ethno-relative positions, the better you can do it. We've done some tests on that. We've tried to organize groups where we've selected for these people here, or even selected for these people and tried to not have these people around, and we're able to move faster. Yeah.
I was actually talking here exactly about that, because sometimes I find someone that is so open, and if you will see their story, they haven't gone to other, but they have an attitude that you can see that they will move on this. You can feel that. And there are people that you could give 13, 16,
Right,
and it's,
nothing's going to happen, yeah. Let me say something about attitude, because I think you were using the term loosely, meaning that there's something about your experience of that person that makes you think that they could learn this quickly, right? But we're shorthanding that by saying they have this attitude. But if we take attitude in a kind of precise psychological sense to be a measurable tendency, kind of evaluative tendency to like or not like something, if we take attitude to mean that, then there's no evidence that that attitude is associated with being good at this. Basically, let me say it again, if you have the attitude of, for instance, liking people, I like Asian people, let's say, that attitude, at least as we measure it, has no correlation with being faster or better at doing perceptual shifting. So, I know that isn't what you meant, okay, but I'm just using that as an excuse to bring up this idea that we should be careful when we make the assessment of people to not depend on relatively visible levels of attitude or knowledge or even skills, but that we should depend more on our experience of that person as a person who's perceptually flexible. And it may be that what you were responding to is somebody who seemed to have that ability to be perceptually flexible, even though they may not have attained that in an international experience. And yes, that probably is associated with moving forward. But we ought to be able to differentiate perceptual flexibility from attitudes, as that term is frequently used by psychologists anyway. Thanks.
You mentioned at the beginning of the speech the meta communication. You're talking, if we talk about communication, excuse my poor knowledge about that, but you do have a sender or receiver and you have a message.
Good.
You are talking about the sender. You are not considering the receiver.
Thank you, you have suggested the next slide. Don't you love it when people do that? Here's how I think it works. So, this is called the empathic communication process. So it's not, it kind of has a sender and receiver. They're in so much interaction with one another that it doesn't make a lot of sense to differentiate them. Here's person A, and here's person B, and they're trying to understand one another in some context. So A has an image of B. How complex is this image? That's an important thing. Meanwhile, B has an image of A. How complex is that image? And then to make the communication work, we need to bring our image of the other into interaction with one another. So A's idea of me is interaction with my idea of her, and that generates this empathic situation in which we are attempting to understand one another, but of course, we're attempting to understand the other in terms of the image that we have of the other. And if we're flexible, if we're perceptually flexible, we allow that image to be adjusted as we go through this process of trying to understand one another. But in fact, the communication is not occurring here, or it's not occurring here, it's occurring here. Yeah, so it's occurring in the interaction itself. Another way of talking about this is what we call the generation of third culture. I'm going to leave you with this idea for those of you who might be keeping time here. Is the idea of third culture, which is, if you've got two different cultures, or three or four or five, let's call it, in this case, A and B. And those two cultures exist in a social context or an organizational context, doesn't matter, some context like this. The simple existence of those cultures is not particularly valuable. It doesn't represent any particular kind of communication. In fact, they may be rather segregated from one another. They may be avoiding one another. There are lots of things that they could be doing. That what the value of this cultural difference, of the potential value of the diversity, comes from each of them trying to adapt to the context, including the other. So this context includes A. So when B tries to adapt to the social context, he or she's also trying to adapt to A, and vice versa. That in the attempt of mutual adaptation, we generate a third culture position. It's a virtual position. It comes into existence as a result of the interaction, and it goes out of existence when we stop the interaction. So it has a virtual or temporary existence. And for those of you who advertise that cultural diversity is valuable, this is where the value comes into the context. It doesn't come from having A around. It comes from A trying to adapt to the context, generating a third culture, essentially that empathic space, which in turn feeds value, feeds innovation into the system. So the innovation doesn't come from A, it comes from A trying to adapt to B, and then generating the value. So, for instance, in international exchange, the value to an international exchange student does not come from simply being in the other cultural context. It comes from that person trying to adapt to that context, and ideally, people in that context trying to adapt to the exchange student, like the home state family or something like that, which generates the third culture position, and that's where the value, the value of intercultural learning or of exchange comes from that mutual adaptation. It doesn't come from just having been in the place. Shall we save it, the rest of it for the end of the day? Any other burning issue that you want to raise before we come to the end?
I have one comment
I was
about
hoping.
about the intercultural exchange programs, because I think one of the values is not only that the hosting part, either the family or the school, create a third culture. I think it's good enough if it creates awareness of the difference. So when we were at AFS, we created a material so the schools could appreciate and work with the presence of the kids to create awareness about the difference and understand the reasons why there was a difference.
Yeah, I think that's a
Because-
precursor condition for
Yeah,
doing
because a
this, yeah.
third culture, it would be to hope too much for a year of presence, for example, in a host family or in a school. So awareness,
Well, it starts with awareness.
yeah,
But I don't think it's too much to hope for this.
no?
No, that if a homestay family is aware of those differences and is motivated to adapt to those differences, that they think it's something that's sort of interesting to adapt to the student, and if the student, as frequently the student is, prepared to adapt to the family, then already, I mean, like from the beginning, it starts generating this third culture position. So I don't think it's that difficult to get it once you have those conditions established.
Still referring to third culture as a virtual thing.
Virtual.
Yeah.
Yeah, virtual.
That's
It's not it doesn't become established in the school. The school doesn't become a third culture. It's a condition that's generated. It's more like this kind of condition of empathy that I put up here before. It's the condition that is generated by my allowing my image of you to interact with your image of me, and with the recognition of the differences, just as you were saying. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you. I look forward to hearing what some of the rest of you have to say, and be around. I'm going to be around for the time. So let's have some conversation.
Okay.